Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Community Classroom. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. We are going to be talking about police powers. This is part 2 of our first discussion about federal power versus state power. We're going to now talk about police powers, and it's not what many of you are probably thinking when you think about police powers. So we're going to clear that up. And this is going to give you some information so that you better understand some of the legal conflicts that are going on now between the state and federal government, and even some of the dynamics going on between the state governments and some of the local entities. And for those of you who are not familiar, I just want to introduce you to the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. And it indicates we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And this information is just to recap what we were talking about that idea of lawlessness and that spirit of lawlessness that is pervading a number of dynamics right now. And part of that lawlessness is about those boundaries and crossing those boundaries and not giving respect that is due to the different sovereigns that are operating, to those lines of demarcation that are indicating where one governmental entity or one legal entity begins and another one ends, and which one has power over what, when, where, and how. And so we're going to talk about these police powers, and you're going to see how this lawlessness dynamic has pervaded a number of things, and it has created a number of complications and a lot of confusion, as many people are not even understanding what police powers are and how they operate and how the line has been crossed, that line in the sand that the Constitution has drawn, has been crossed. And this is just additional information you can go back and look at from Strong's Concordance about the idea of lawlessness. And here's a little bit more information that we also talked about. So let's recap here. We talked previously about federal power versus state power, and as you recall, federal power is constitutionally limited. It's limited in terms of its force. It's limited in terms of what it covers. It's limited in terms of its influence. And the powers of the federal government are enumerated and delegated, meaning they are specifically spelled out in the Constitution. And so if it's not spelled out in the Constitution, it's probably because it doesn't belong to the federal government. And it is reserved to the states and reserved to the people, the citizens. Now, there are a lot of conflicts going on right now, and these conflicts are going to grow. And so you have to remember that you have two major sovereigns operating. So you have that federal sovereign, and then you have those state sovereigns. And remember, we talked about the state sovereigns are like kings. And the federal government is more like an emperor or an empire. But those kings are operating as their own individual sovereigns. And so when you're looking to see who has the power, who has the ability to influence, who has control over a particular topic or issue, there's some questions that you need to ask to get a better understanding of whether this entity or that entity has the power. Now, what's been happening, which is very interesting, if you look at some of the acts and you see some of the amendments that have been taking place, some of the tweaking, you will see that there have been these dynamics where things have been adjusted, and the excuse for the adjustments are these assertions about interstate commerce, because interstate commerce is federal. And so what you see is when you look at the eviction moratorium and things like that, you see this invoking of interstate commerce in order to insert into this typically what is considered a state dynamic when you're talking about health, safety, and welfare. However, when you insert this idea of interstate commerce being involved, then you can then invoke the federal government, but that doesn't mean that the invocation is actually legitimate. Another question that you have to ask is this issue about individual constitutional rights? And then you have to also consider whether the action that is being pursued is actually a commandeering of state power. And so if there's a commandeering of state power, the power that is usually understood as belonging to the state, then you also have another conflict. And so these are some things to think about and some questions to ask when you hear about issues that are coming up. These are some of the questions to ask when you are thinking about them and you're thinking about who really has the power in this situation. And you're going to start to see some assertions of power really soon, as there are more assertions about who has what power. Okay, so keep this in mind. With respect to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, the powers that are not delegated, not spelled out as belonging to the United States by the Constitution, and if it's not something that's prohibited by the states, it's reserved to the states, meaning it belongs to the states, or it can belong to the people. But that power does not belong to the federal government unless the Constitution says it belongs to the federal government, generally speaking. And so all of the rights of the states and the people are all of those rights and powers that don't belong to the federal government. And so therefore they belong to the people or to the state. And so those rights that are for the state, that belong to the state, they are known as police powers. And so these are the executive powers of the individual states. And for those individual states, those governors are the CEOs of the states. And the police powers are about general health, safety, and welfare of the state. And so when you are talking about the health, safety, and welfare of the people, generally speaking, that is under the umbrella of the governor of the respective state. That is not something that belongs typically to the federal government. Now, there are times where there might be collaboration, or when interstate commerce is invoked or a part of the dynamic, then you can see the federal government inserting itself. But there still is that line of demarcation. And those police powers very specifically belong to the respective states. And to help you think about this a little bit more, you think about the court systems. You have state family courts, but you don't have federal family courts. You have state child protective services. You don't have federal child protective services. And so when you're talking about those health, safety, and welfare issues, they predominantly fall under the purview of the governor of the state. However, there are some instances, again, when you're talking about constitutional rights and you're talking about interstate commerce, or you're talking about anything in which the federal government is sort of occupying the field. If you're not talking about one of those dynamics that belong to the federal government, it's spelled out in the Constitution, you are generally talking about state power or power of the people. And as we wrap this up, what we are looking at in terms of analyzing the power, who has the power, when we are looking to see if there is a valid exercise of police power, we are looking to see if the subject matter is one for which police power might be appropriately invoked. Is this about health, safety, and welfare? Is this a power that traditionally rests with the state and that has not been delineated to the federal government? What's happening now, however, is you're seeing all of these conflicts because you have a usurpation of state powers often. And there is an invocation of police power, and that invocation in some instances appears to be inappropriate. And so that needs to be taken into consideration in order to determine whether the action taken by the federal government is in fact legitimate and whether it can stand when challenged. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.